Paul Floyd, and I'm going to be your tour guide on this venture. We're going to check out the Guidestones and some other cool places in Elberton and Elbert County, and hopefully you'll get a good understanding of the whole process that went into making the Guidestones, and also you'll learn a little more about the people of this town and this county. This is where all of my dad's family, well, most of my dad's family live here. They've been here for a long time. There's a lot of interest in the Guidestones, and I moved to Athens, Georgia back in '93, but I've always brought people from there out here to see the stones, just because it's something pretty cool to see and very out of the ordinary. We'll pretty much cover every step of the process, from blasting the rock out of the ground to when they finally erected the Guidestones. We'll show you every step of the way. This is a cool little road because it's very twisty and turny, and once we were old enough to drive, it was fun to we could come down here and see, you know, who could go through it the fastest without wrecking their car or just running off the road.
How far did you grow up from the Guidestones?
Maybe 5-6 miles, but it's just funny because we never came over here. The only time we would come this way was for going to Anderson to get school clothes in the fall. That was our annual routine because we're actually closer to Anderson, South Carolina from here than we are from Athens. So we just always went to Anderson, and this is the way we would go. Now, one time I saw a cool fireball hit that pole right there. We were going to Anderson to do some shopping, and lightning struck that transformer, and this huge fireball just rolled over the roof of the hood of the car. It's crazy. But I think if you guys want to, we'll cruise on up to the Guidestones. In June of 1979, a well-dressed gentleman came to Elberton, Georgia, looking for help with a very unusual project. For a little bit of background, Elberton is called the granite capital of the world because of the massive amounts of granite that are here and the sheer volume of monuments that are turned out every year. But get back to our well-dressed gentleman. His first stop upon reaching town was the offices of the Elberton Granite Finishing Corporation. He was greeted there by the owner, Joe Finley. He introduced himself to Joe as R.C. Christian and said that he was looking to commission a monument that would contain 10 guiding principles in 8 different languages and also incorporate these astronomical features that would serve to help any survivors of a future catastrophe. Well, as you can imagine, Finley finds this very strange, but he's intrigued by the scope and size of the project and tells Christian that he's on board. Well, at that point, Mr. Christian asks if he can recommend a local bank to take care of the financial aspects of the project. Finley says yeah, and sends him to Granite City Bank President Wyatt Martin. Well, R.C. Christian introduces himself to Martin, but he says, look, man, this is not my real name, it's a pseudonym. I represent a group of loyal, God-fearing Americans who want to remain anonymous. And he proceeds to explain the project again to Martin. Well, Martin says, hey, I'm on board, but I need to know your real name so that I can do my financial background checks to make sure this is all, on the up and up. R.C. Christian agrees to it, but he makes Martin swear an oath of secrecy to never reveal his real name to anyone else. Well, they get that out of the way. The Granite City Bank takes the finances into escrow for the project. Finley's corporation starts work on the stones, and at this point he makes contact with an Elberton contractor named Wayne Mullinex.
We own about 54 acres out there on the Hartwell Highway, and Joe Finley owned Elberton Granite Finishing. And Joe was a personal friend of mine, and we was offshoring cows out of the state, and he called me and said that this R.C. Christian had come to town and wanted some monuments put up, and wanted to know would I put a foundation in South Georgia. And I said, sure, we'll go wherever you want to go. Got closer to time that the deadline was to set this monument, and Joe still didn't know where to go in South Georgia with it. The man had a spot that aligned with the star and the moon and all this kind of stuff, but I didn't know what it was. But anyway, time had got within about 2 weeks when we were supposed to set it, and one day I went into Joe's office, and at the time my wife's sister worked for Joe, and of course me and Joe was in the Shrine Club and the Masons together, and so I just walked right on in his office. I said, Joe, look, if you hadn't got the place located, we might could set it on my property out there on 77. Well, he kind of lit up. He said, yeah, that might be a good idea. I said, let me get Mr. Christian and we'll let you know. So a week or two rocked on and come back and said, yeah, Mr. Christian was here, and that met everything he wanted on the crown of the hill and no trees. And
the stones are unveiled here in March of 1980 in a public ceremony. It's attended by about 400 people. And it's rumored that in the crowd is R.C. Christian himself. Now, at this point, only two men had met Mr. Christian, and that would be Joe Finley and Wyatt Martin. But he would soon meet a third man. So the inscriptions on the Guidestones read as follows. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Unite humanity with a living new language. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. Protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. Let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. Avoid petty laws and useless officials. Balance personal rights with social duties. Prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. The inscriptions are in English, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, Classical Hebrew, Swahili, Hindi, and Spanish. The four ancient languages on the capstone are Sanskrit, Babylonian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Classical Greek. And the message on the capstones reads, "Let these be guidestones to an age of reason." When I tell people the story of the Guidestones, usually the number one question that gets asked is, who is R.C. Christian? In this area, the overwhelming reaction was that, that's just the Granite Association trying to get some tourism in here. I didn't grow up knowing anybody who believed that R.C. Christian came and paid for these stones to be put up. Everyone that I know is pretty certain that Joe Finley had something to do with it, that it was basically just all a facade to increase tourism.
You said you were invited to the unveiling?
Yes,
Did you know Mr. Joe Finley?
I've known Joe Finley for a long time, but he didn't invite me. I received an invitation in the mail. I don't know who it was from, let's put it that way. At that time, I didn't know Joe Finley. I got to know Joe Finley better afterwards. There was a man who called himself R.C. Christian, who came to Elberton, interviewed people, found out that Elberton would accept it. Because see, Elberton, the city of Elberton had to accept it before they could erect it, because it had to have some perpetuity to it before they could erect something that big and huge and permanent. Somebody has to look after it. So he was there. He made the list of people to come. He paid the money, and it was not Joe Finley.
Joe Finley has passed away, but in his stead, his former secretary provided this statement.
My name is Barbara Thomason, and I was Joe Finley's secretary. I remember when the Guidestones were being made. It was such a large project, and it took up so much of the company's resources and time that I just wanted it to be finished. The cost of the Guidestones was over $100,000. Joe spent a lot on publicity of the Guidestones. Local money and several local men were involved, and I think one of the reasons for the Guidestones is to bring in tourists, but I can't say that for sure. Only Mr. Christian would be able to answer that, and I did meet Mr. Christian. One day we were told that Mr. Christian was in town to answer any questions about the construction of the monument. I personally asked him if it mattered on which sides of the capstone the various ancient languages were placed. He said it did not matter. That was a long time ago, and I wouldn't be able to identify or recognize him today. I can't say with certainty who R.C. Christian is, but I am almost positive I know. However, I am not going to tell who I think he is.
I do know this, that one of the more prevailing views is that the granite industry put this thing up to attract attention, but I don't buy into that, because having been in marketing of the granite industry and promoting it, we could have spent our money in a lot more feasible ways to be sure that we got a positive message out. EGA, Elberton Granite Association, had no connection with this project other than it was built by one of our member firms, and it was built out of granite.
1980, when the Guidestones were put up,
Mm-hmm.
you were the EGA president?
That's right.
Okay. And what were some of your initial reactions to some of that story?
Well, I was like everybody else. I thought it was totally crazy. It didn't make any sense. I went along with it. I was supportive of it because it was going, as far as the workmanship and the granite and what they did with it was unbelievable. The story behind it was what never did really make sense. Well, I mean, we never did know the truth about the whole thing, but I was kind of on the inside, so I finally learned what it was really all about. The bottom line was to try to get a lot of tourists into the county, and it has done that. Don't think it ever went over quite as big worldwide as it was maybe thought to have been, but it still might happen in the future.
In 1984, Dr. David Reagan of Lamb and Lion Ministries in Texas wrote an article about the Guidestones in his newsletter, which is now available online. He accompanied this article with a radio broadcast. Shortly thereafter, he received a letter signed by R.C. Christian responding to his comments. If the story of R.C. Christian was made up, and the Guidestones' purpose is primarily to bring in tourists, one question would be, why would Joe Finley respond in a private letter in the guise of R.C. Christian 4 years after the Guidestones were unveiled? Or for that matter, write a book published 6 years after the Guidestones were erected? This book, Common Sense Renewed by Robert Christian, expounds upon the philosophy underlying the Guidestones' inscribed precepts. The main 4 stones stand at a height of 16 feet 4 inches, and when you add the capstone to that, the total height is 19 feet 3 inches. The total weight for these stones is 245,000 pounds, or 122.5 tons. My dad worked in the granite industry. My grandfather worked in the granite industry. It's dangerous work, it's hard work, and it's a very involved process. So it's not something to take lightly, the manufacture of this monument. The first step of the process is in the quarry, because the rock has to come out of the ground. They begin that by cutting sides in the rock with a torch. They drill holes in that cut and place explosive charges, and they blow these charges until the rock is separated from the bed and they're able to lift it out, which is where you see the standing water. Subsequent cuts are made primarily by two methods, and no matter what method, they're always made according to the grain of the granite. The first method is jet piercing, which is this torch, and it can be automatic or manual, which if you're the guy having to do the work, you probably want it to be automatic because it's a very loud process, and if it's automatic, the worker gets to sit in a sound booth while the torch is operating. It makes a very nice wide cut, but it's an expensive method. Another popular way is to use a wire saw. Much more economical than jet piercing. It makes a narrow cut that often requires a worker to come behind with a sledgehammer and wedge to finish the cut. The next step is to drill the holes for the charges. The holes are drilled along the lines that have been cut with a wire saw, and also in other strategic locations. After the holes are drilled, it's time to place the charges. These charges are black powder. The charge goes in first, followed by dirt bags to prevent the charge from just blowing back out of the hole. The charges are detonated remotely. The final step in the process involves lifting the blocks from great depths. They use derricks to get them out of the quarry.
One of the key moments, I guess, say, in the development was when they pulled the big blocks out. Nobody had ever pulled any blocks this big out in Elberton that we knew of, this big. We're not talking about these slabs here. We're talking about big blocks these slabs were cut out of, some of them. And so, you know, we, you know how it is when you go to a car race, you don't want it to happen, but if a wreck happens, it happens. And we didn't want one of those derricks to get pulled in the hole, but if it happened, we wanted to be there, click, 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 you know. So I remember there was doubt that day that they pulled those blocks as to where the derricks would handle them.
I'm John W. Burgess. I worked at Fernbank Science Center for 27 years, and I've been retired now since 1995. The intent of the monument has changed. Originally, Mr. Christian wanted this hole in the Guidestone, in the middle stone here, to have a hole that would look out to station stones that would mark the rising of the sun at the summer solstice, at the equinox, at the winter solstice, and also the moonrise, and that was the intent. I got here about 1984. I looked at the stones, and the stones weren't like that. They were different. It looked to me like the stones had been rotated 90 degrees. I broke the news to Mr. Finley. We had gone to the office of Mr. Finley and found the notes that Mr. Christian had made. So I said, well, it looks like it's been rotated 90 degrees, but I wanted to come back and make some more accurate measurements and find out if that was the case. And it turns out it wasn't. They employed a surveyor whose name skips me. He was to place the stones. And he'd placed the stones not according to original plans, but my measurements indicated that he had a better plan. He changed the plan and made instead of a clever alignment monument, he made a unique alignment monument. with these 5 stones, you didn't need these station stones out to the east and west. All you needed to do was to walk around the stones and make gaps between 2 stones. And those gaps would give you the sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset that you wanted. Every 19 years, the moon rises furthest northeast and furthest southeast. And that is marked here on these stones. Well, let me sidetrack a bit. The intent was to mark those. Well, I'm 99.99% sure the intent was there. But no one knew how the stones were aligned except the surveyor. And some months after the stones were erected, he died, and the secret went with him. And it wasn't until I came along that I figured out what he had done, and I'm certain that's what he'd done. This is why these stones are spaced this way. Up here, the opening in the top, that hole up there, in the middle of the day, lets a spot of light come through onto the stone. All right?
Okay.
And it is supposed to form, over the course of a year, that spot would form an analemma at noontime. And you say, what is an analemma? An analemma is, if you look on an old Earth globe, out in the middle of the Pacific, there's this real weird, skinny, 8-looking object, letter 8-looking object, with numbers on it.
Oh, okay.
That is used to tell how far off the sundial is from our clocks and watches. There was supposed to be an analemma up here. Problem. If it is the middle of the day in the summer, the spot of light coming through that hole doesn't strike the smooth area on the stone up there, the dressed area. Just when the sun is highest in the sky, the spot of light hits this central gnomon here, lower than the dressed area. So if you want to put an analemma up there, you've got to know how to do it, and you've got to redress the stone. It doesn't work the way Mr. Christian had planned it. If you look through this hole here, you're supposed to see the North Star because it's supposed to be oriented true north and south. I have been over here many times. I've photographed through that hole at night. I've looked through that hole at night. It ain't pointing toward the North Star. That, in essence, are the astronomical alignments and implications of the Guidestones.
What would Dr. David Reagan of Lamb and Lion Ministries say to elicit the private letter from R.C. Christian? In his September-October 1984 Lamplighter newsletter, now available online, he levels accusations that the precepts of the Guidestones are satanically influenced. Reagan's article states, quote, "The monument had been paid for by a mysterious group affiliated with the New Age movement. Since Satan is using that movement to herald the emergence of a universal false messiah, I can only conclude that the Georgia Guidestones may well contain the 10 Commandments of the Antichrist." End quote. In a signed letter that gave no return address but was postmarked Houston, Texas, R.C. Christian responds to Dr. Reagan, quote, "You are completely mistaken in your belief that the monument is related in any way to the New Age movement, or to any religious group or sect. The Guidestones are linked with no specific religion, philosophy, or cult. They are directed to men of goodwill of all religious faiths. They are also directed to men of goodwill of no religious faith, in the hope that these individuals will also align their lives with the infinite God." End quote. Handwritten at the end of the letter was an additional note, quote, "I have never heard of the New Age movement." End quote. Despite R.C. Christian's assurances, Dr. Reagan was not convinced. He replied to Christian Care of Wyatt Martin, quote, "I have no doubt that a study of God's Word would convince you that the best thing you could do to assist humanity would be to authorize someone to blow your monument to pieces with a few sticks of dynamite." End quote.
As a local Christian pastor and concerning the Guidestones, they disturb me greatly that many occults go there and they worship and they sacrifice. And I've seen some of this firsthand and traveling by. I used to live up pretty close to them and would have people tell me they were in their secretive acts again, and so we would ride up by there. But yeah, obviously as a Christian, things should be brought into the light, and a lot of these things are done at night, certain times of the year, and are very secretive. Right.
But you have a first-hand account of seeing.
Yes, I certainly do.
And do you know, like maybe more specifically, what type of groups, or do you know if they're?
I don't. I know several times going by there, it was folks in hooded robes, long brown robes, and as they went around, they would chant. There were several candles. I believe one candle was set in a hole in the stone there. So I don't know exactly what group it is. I know that many have said the Rosicrucians go up there and do their worship, so I assume it was probably them. Some hearsay from people that were close by was that there was some animal sacrifice, and we did find some remains, whether it was a stray possum or whatever that came up and just happened to die there. We don't know. It was just some hair, some blood.
Things should be brought into the light. Like, would you be able to expound on your view?
Well, the Christian perspective on being secretive and things being brought into the light goes along with what Jesus said. He said that all things that are good will be exposed. Everything will be exposed. And I guess our motives and the way we go about stuff in life is, if we have nothing to hide, we won't hide it. If things are underhanded and shady, then they're hidden, obviously. So I believe this is a big factor surrounding the Guidestones. There's a lot of mystery that we see behind the erection of the Guidestones, and even in the preparation beforehand. So as a Christian pastor, that disturbs me. And I believe the message was placed there as a guide for the occultic groups. And saying that, I mean the message of the Guidestones is a message of population control, and we know that's a big part of the occult, and the Rosicrucians and the witches and warlocks and such people. So we understand that there's a link between those people and the message on the Guidestones. If we say it's just an attraction to visitors, I think if we looked at records and if we could record who visits it, I believe there are probably a lot more of the cult groups that come than just normal people passing by.
After the rock is lifted out of the quarry, it's taken to the granite shed where the work continues. In high school, we could take something called granite lab, which is a miniature granite shed, and like you learn to use all of the different machinery. We're going to visit King's Monument Company, Hillcrest Granite, and Keystone Memorials to see what happens next. The first stop is the diamond saw. After they bring the rock in, they set it up, and this gigantic saw blade cuts the quarry piece into smaller, more manageable pieces. It's almost like slicing bread. It just goes back and forth. They use the water to cool it, and you can set these things on automatic and they'll cut the entire rock up for you. The blades themselves have man-made diamonds on the tips, and that's been a huge improvement in the ability to cut this rock. After they cut the blocks into smaller pieces, they take those pieces to the polishing mills. Now today they use an automatic polisher which is computer controlled, but at the time the Guidestones were made they would have been using hand polishers. But that really doesn't matter because the Guidestones weren't polished. Polishing closes pores on the rock, which not only gives it a shiny appearance, but makes it easier to work with later on in the process.
This facility was where the Guidestones was manufactured. It's under different ownership now, but Mr. Finley was operating this building when the Guidestones were manufactured and they were processed in this plant. It was quite an undertaking for them to be built. Those were some massive pieces of stone out there.
After the stone has been cut and prepared, it is worked by the hands of the stone cutters. And just as there are groups that hate the Guidestones and think they're evil and want to tear them down, there are also people who love the message of the Guidestones, and they consider this area to be holy ground. It's supposedly along these ley lines that imbue it with mystical energy. Supposedly there are crystals in the granite, and those crystals imbue this place with power. And so you'll find lots of people who love the Guidestones.
I loved the Guidestones. I liked what they stood for. At the time, I was fairly prominent psychic in Atlanta. I got an invitation and I went to the unveiling and enjoyed it. Yes, I was married there. Oh, Lord, I've even forgotten the year now. But I was married there about 30 years ago, I guess, 25, 30 years ago. They were fairly new when I got married there. I was married there, as I said, in twilight time. And it was very peaceful, very beautiful. There was a white dove there at the time that flew over my head. We got pictures of it, and it was fun. It was very festive. The reason for the attraction from the psychic phenomena is the fact that the energy there has a magnetic pull. And the magnetic pull is magnified by the granite. And therefore, it's like Stone Mountain. It magnifies the draw, the attention, the ability to tune in, if you will. It gives a certain energy effect, and you can feel the energy if you're conscious of it. That when you walk close to those stones, you can feel it. If you're not attuned to it, you're not going to feel a thing.
Who's first?
I'm Tommy Benton.
And I'm George Mathis, and we're from the National Society of Paranormal Investigation and Research out of Raleigh, North Carolina. And we just happened to be down this way doing a paranormal investigation for a private residence, and knew that this location was here and just had to come by and check it out.
All right. Well, I've heard that there are energies here, positive energies. Some people may be negative energies. I don't know, but I was wondering, do you guys have a way to measure that or check it out? And if so, have you gotten any readings?
We brought our equipment and we've attempted to use, to get some readings here, but at this point it's been not active as we would hope. But
what we try to measure is electromagnetic field fluctuation. We typically do this in homes where there's paranormal activity, but since this is supposed to be an energy area, we thought, well, let's try our meters here and see what happened. But like Tommy said, we haven't really come up with anything that's substantial. So maybe we hit the off day.
It's an interesting place for a small town. It's an interesting thing to occur. They are beautiful, they are big, they are monstrous, and they have terrific symbolism.
You were the stone cutter, the granite cutter on the Georgia Guidestones.
I laid all the joints and laid all the upright pieces on it. The life of a stone cutter used to be 20 years on kind of the dust, and I done lived through three lives. Mostly when I first started, you had to knock enough skin off your hand to make an apron, and I just about done it. A lot of skill to it. It really is all of it skill, nearly. Cutting and cutting letters and things, and like cutting them lambs and things. It's you just pitch it in your mind, and you can just cut it.
And so, what was your initial reaction when you heard about projects as large as the Guidestones?
Well, there wasn't no more than cutting a piece that big to me, 'cause I know how to lay it out and seen the picture. He showed me the picture of it, and then it was imaged in my mind of how it looks, how to cut it.
My name is Dennis Ballou. I've been a stone cutter since 1966. I graduated here in Elberton. And when I got out of school, I went straight into the apprenticeship program of cutting stone.
And then how more specifically did you get started?
I started cutting footstones in the evening after I got out of school. And that's how I could make a little bit of money every week, where I could date the young ladies and take them out on the weekend for a hot dog or something. And when I first started, our tools that you can see right here on the rock were all of them were actually steel, whereas of now, all our tools are carbide tipped. It's much harder, and you can sharpen them, and they'll stay sharpened longer and do a cleaner job. Rock has grain. It's like wood. You can take a piece of wood with a good sharp knife and whittle. I guess everybody whittles a little bit. But you can take a good sharp knife and whittle, and you can feel that knife dig in. And sometimes you can't get it to go in, it'll want to come out. That's what you call the grain. And the rock is the same way. It's got a grain. I know exactly what it's going to take for these pitching tools to cut this straight side here, because it's running out. So here's where I start my squaring. Now, we've got 3 sides of the base. This is called a base. All right, now the size I want is 110, 1 foot and 10 inches, which is 22 inches. We're doing what we call laying it out. And then when I knock this off, we're going to turn the rock over. I'm going to square it. We're going to turn the rock over, then I'll pitch it again from the bottom side. When I turn the rock back over, then we will clean up the side. It'll be like a picture. Watch this lick come out. A lot of people come and watch. The first thing they say, oh, that's easy. Well, I don't think there's a place on my body that hasn't got a scar. Now we're going to turn it over. Square it with the red pen again. Turn the rock back over. All right, we're fixing to start back over. All right, this is the outside way. We only went halfway, remember? Now we're gonna clean it up. There's the first lick. Second lick. This is the last of the cutting part, all except for the corner line. Okay, we're now I'm putting on the corner lines on the base. Is a finished base. You can see where it looks like ripples in the water. That's the artistic work. What we're cutting here is the die. Most folks go into a cemetery, they call them tombstones, but we call them dies. A finished product, a product that I'm proud of.
I could see how people could have problems with some of them though, the 500 million limit on the population. Yeah, if you're talking about killing everybody that's alive right now to reach that, it'd be a big problem. But you got to remember that when he put these up, like we were in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and every day, you know, the talk of nuclear war. You could turn on the television and watch movies about a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. And I think that plays a lot into the fears that R.C. Christian and his group had at the time, that any minute we were just going to destroy ourselves. So when you look at it that way, he's saying if war comes and everyone is killed off and the survivors get a chance to start over, since you got a blank slate, I mean, try to keep things at a point to where there's enough resources for everyone who's left on the planet.
A lot of people get upset with the fact that they limit the Earth's numbers. They go bananas with that because that is God's providence, but it's also trying to get people to use their own heads for something besides a hat rack, as my father would say.
The population control mentioned in the first guideline is probably the most controversial part of the Guidestones. Does it reference some sort of genocide? What about rebuilding society after a nuclear catastrophe? Let's look at what R.C. Christian himself had to say about population control. In Common Sense Renewed, Christian makes it clear he believes the Earth's resources cannot sustain the population numbers that result from unregulated reproduction. He writes, quote, "Reproduction is no longer exclusively a personal matter. Society must have a voice and some power of direction in regulating this vital function. It is vitally important that each national government have a considered population policy. Overcrowding human beings in conditions of squalor and ignorance is dehumanizing." End quote. Christian solutions include, quote, "Desirable mental and physical qualities can be enhanced in future human populations by encouraging their reproduction and by discouraging the reproduction of their opposites." End quote. So here you have a monument with its birth covered in mystery. Add to that the ideas of population control, world courts, and a universal language, and conspiracy theories abound. And eventually, so did vandalism.
Decades and decades there was no graffiti on it. And it used to really kind of puzzle us. I mean, they'd go in cemeteries, you know, and deface monuments. They wouldn't touch this thing out here by itself. Of course, I'd tell them power of the devil might be protecting the reason. But then graffiti began to appear out here. And Doyle Johnson, the director, the executive vice president of the Elberton Granite Association, says it really got hot and heavy about the time of the election.
We did have some vandalism done to the monuments, and we did put some security up after that, and they have been restored as best as they can be restored. The person that had vandalized them knew exactly what to put on it as far as all but destroying the granite. It is monitored now so that anybody that goes on the property, we are aware of it immediately when they go on the property.
I don't think anyone has a right to come here and vandalize the stones or tear them down. I mean, when you get to the end of the day, these stones were made by Elbert County hands, doing hard work in the quarries and sheds throughout the county, and people need to respect that. You can disagree and not have to destroy something. A wise person told me that if this is the best that the devil can do in his battle against Christianity, then the devil is in a sorry state. And I have to agree with him. It kind of fits with the other situations too. If this is the best that the New World Order can do to enslave mankind, or if this is the best that the Rosicrucians can do to control everyone, I mean, they're going to have to try a lot harder than that. I mean, this is stone with words on it in a former cow pasture. The unconventional and controversial precepts of the Guidestones, coupled with the pseudonym chosen by their author, fuel speculation that secret societies were involved.
And they said that R.C. Christians had done it, that I thought R.C. Christian was standing for Rosicrucian, which was a very prominent organization at the time. And they did things like that. It's a spiritual group that believed very heavily in metaphysics and in things beyond the realm of this ken. It's the best way I know to say it. The Rosicrucian is a spiritual organization. They believed in reincarnation. They believe in... Rosicrucian is a type of Christianity. I want to say that, but that's going to cause a lot of dissent among people.
Dr. Lee Irwin, Religious Studies Department, College of Charleston, and I teach comparative religion, shamanism, and Western esotericism, along with transpersonal theory and other issues. Rosicrucians are part of my area of interest and study, and I've been studying the Rosicrucian material, not for a long time, for the last 5 or 6 years, but it's all part of a larger project, which is the study of Western esotericism more generally. So it's just one area of my interest of study.
People link the Georgia Guidestones to the Rosicrucian order because of the pseudonym R.C. Christian. What is the significance of that pseudonym?
Well, R.C. is a traditional way of representing Christian Rosencrantz, which is C.R., but usually it's actually transcribed R.C. And Christian Rosencrantz is the founder of the Rosicrucians, goes back to a manuscript that was found in, written in 1618, and the Fama Confessatio and other manuscripts, and tells the story of his life and how he traveled around, went to Damascus and to Spain and to other countries and learned the esoteric teachings, alchemy, astrology, magic, and other traditions. Came back to Germany and established a secret order, and the secret order was the Rosicrucian order. And from there, and from the publication of that manuscript, Rosicrucianism developed in the early 1700s in Germany, and then spread to France, Europe, and eventually to America. So RC represents a symbol of the founding of the Rosicrucian order.
Do the guidelines that are on the Georgia Guidestones, or their explanation found in Common Sense Renewed, seem Rosicrucian in nature based on your expertise?
I'd say no, though a few of them have some resonance with Rosicrucian teachings, but only in this very broad, general way. I mean, there's nothing in the guidelines which actually is purely Rosicrucian. There's some ideas that are in the guidelines that are more generally applicable. I mean, you could say a few of them have some resonance, but there's nothing really explicitly Rosicrucian, and that's one thing. The other thing is that some of the ideas, like the low population idea and the world order idea, those are not Rosicrucian. In fact, some of the ideas contradict Rosicrucian, so I don't see it as Rosicrucian.
Joe Finley was a high-ranking Mason. Many people believe the Guidestones to be Masonic. Did you see any connection there?
That's a harder question to answer because there's two different ways to look at that question. From the point of view of Masonic technique, you know, what they would call a Mason's craft, yeah, I mean, it's stonework. So in terms of stonework, there's a long history of Masons doing stonework. Now, at the level of ideology and actual teachings, it's like the question about the Rosicrucians, it's vague. It's not very explicit. For example, here's one idea. Almost all Masonic constructions have the square and the compass cut into the stone somewhere to signify that it's Masonic. I don't know if this construction has that anywhere, because if it doesn't, then it isn't explicitly Masonic. Otherwise, it's always carved in there. But if it's not, then it's only implicit, you know, that yes, the stonework is done probably by masons, but there's nothing that's trying to, like say the 10 principles, would I call them Masonic? Not really. I mean, some of it could be in a very low level way associated with Masonic teachings, but I wouldn't say it's explicitly Masonic in terms of ideology, so no.
After the stonecutters have completed their work, the final stage is sandblasting, which creates the designs and letters. As you can see here, modern sandblasting is nearly all automatic, and only details are done by hand. On the Guidestones, however, all sandblasting was done by hand.
Charlie Clamp, the engraver, said it was the toughest job he ever did, because the way they engrave is to put panels of stencil, glue it onto the surface of the granite, and then sandblast over it. But he said these surfaces were not smooth, and it was hard to get those stencil panels. They glue them on there to get them to glue on where they would hold good enough to when that sandblast process started that they would hold and not, loosen up.
Sandblasting begins with a rubber stencil being placed and glued onto the granite. At the time the Guidestones were made, the stencil design would be hand-drawn and hand-cut, but today's stencil designs are computer-generated and automatically cut. Once the stencil has been applied, the stone is sandblasted. The design areas exposed within the stencil are etched by the sand, while the portion covered by the rubber remains untouched. This transfers the design into the stone. Details such as delicate lines, shading, or 3D effects are sandblasted manually using specialized nozzles. The etched letters and designs are frequently spray painted black at this stage, and then the stencil is removed. Now mud can be applied to protect the painted surfaces while final details are added. The mud is then removed and the monument is complete. Stones are unveiled here in March of 1980 in a public ceremony. It's attended by about 400 people. And it's rumored that in the crowd is R.C. Christian himself. Now, at this point, only two men had met Mr. Christian, and that would be Joe Finley and Wyatt Martin. But he would soon meet a third man.
I met Mr. Christian. Now, a man who said he was Mr. Christian. Joe Finley called me about, and I forget the time frame, something like 2 years after this was up, and said Mr. Christian was coming to Elberton. And if I would agree not to try to interrogate him as to what his real name was and where he was from and all that, that I could talk to him. I could have an audience with him. So the day he came through, though, I had an appointment that night. So I got to meet with him briefly at a restaurant downtown. And Mr. Finley was there and a couple of other people. And the man walked in. He was about 6'2", above average height, real sharp features, I'd say in his 70s. Hair was gone except for kind of like mine. He had gray, and he had on a short sleeve blue shirt with a tie. Very conservatively dressed, Of course, the ground rules were, he said, Mr. Christian, and I sat down, and I traveled a lot in my duties with the Granite Association, and you more or less could accents, you could visually place people at geographic locations, and I guesstimated he was from the Midwest, Dakotas, somewhere like that, based by, obviously wasn't from New Jersey, or, but I'd say he was a Midwesterner, and he had been to the Joyce Kilmer National Forest the day before to study a virgin stand of hardwood trees that existed only at the Joyce Kilmer National Forest, which I believe is in North Carolina or Virginia, somewhere up that way. And that triggered, and I began to notice he was very astute about botany, those trees. He used a scientific name rather than hard oak or hardwood like I would. And he was real upset about them beginning a logging project in the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, saying that these trees should be protected and not be used for commercial purposes. And so he was definitely cognizant more than the average person about plant life and trees and stuff like that. He's really into that. And then I began to tell him that some people view this as, satanic and all that kind of thing, and the deal about maintain humanity under 500 billion or something like whatever the precept is. And he said, oh, none of that. Said this is just a basic tenets, 10 rules to guide mankind to protect the earth. See, then it gravitated back to the environmental concern that he had. And he said protecting the earth and its resources is the main projection of those guides. And that was basic. That's what he said. He was, interesting fellow. Of course, when the story got out, they said, oh, he was just an actor that Joe Finley hired, and all that kind of stuff. But he was a very, not a real, what you think. He wasn't wearing robes with stars on them and a cone hat, what I'm getting at. He was a very average Joe type guy and very sensible, I wish I could have had a lot more time with him to talk to him and really to probe and try to, find out where he was from, who he was, and what his business was, but I really didn't have time to really get down and dirty with him,
The belief in Elberton that the Guidestones are a local promotional project even led many to think Joe Finley hired an actor to portray R.C. Christian. If Finley would hire an actor to portray Christian, would Finley also have written a letter to a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1992, 12 years after the unveiling of the Guidestones? The producer of this film obtained a letter to Francis Crick, who jointly won the 1962 Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work with molecular DNA. The letter, dated January 17, 1992, reads, Dear Dr. Crick, you are engaged in a study of the human brain and its functions. This is a very challenging task, and one that will be of great value if your efforts meet with success in any way comparable to that which you have achieved in the field of genetics. I hope that in your remaining years you will also find time to make a contribution in the area of population management in order to bring humanity into rational balance with the total biosphere. I enclose material relating to the Georgia Guidestones monument, erected near Elberton, Georgia nearly 12 years ago. That monument attempts to focus public opinion on our need for managing our own reproduction. The book, Common Sense Renewed, was written in connection with the dedication of the monument. Its thoughts on the nature of God may be of interest to you as a scientist, in view of your current interests. I hope that you will someday visit the Georgia Guidestones, and that you will in some way help to achieve its goals. I have asked Mr. Merriman, my publisher, to forward this material to you. If you have any comments for me, you may address me through him. Signed, Robert Christian.
The question is, what do I think about the Georgia Guidestones? Well, I think they're positive, or greater positive than they are a negative.
A lot of times at night you would see a light up on top of the very top of it. And so one night I went up there to see what the light was, and kids had thrown a rope across from one side to the other and climbed up on top and had candles burning up there.
Don't know why they're there. Don't know who put them there. Don't know no information about the Guidestones.
Thought they were always a little freaky on Halloween. I didn't go up there on Halloween. There was no way I'd go up there on Halloween. Mass genocide I'm not a huge fan of, but yeah, I don't know. It's they're pretty much good rules to live by though. I'm a supporter.
You know, when people find out you're from Elberton, they're like, oh, that's where those creepy Guidestones are. And I'm like, yeah, but you know, most of the people I know, like if you go to the Guidestones, it's like high schoolers getting drunk, you know? Like,
yeah, we'd come here at night. We'd climb up well, we didn't, but I had a cousin who could get between the stones and climb up to the very top.
Actually get tired of trying to explain this to people, like,
you're like, what?
And it doesn't make any sense. It's not like, oh, it's this really cool, it's just like this weird thing out in the middle of nowhere. It's not even like a cool city around.
I mean, we couldn't convince like 2 people to come with us today.
And they're like 20 miles away.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
She wouldn't come.
Yeah.
She said no.
They say that first one is an insinuation of genocide, that kind of thing. I don't necessarily take it that way. I see how people could. Some of the things make sense. They would be good. I think we do need to take care of this planet. We've got nowhere else to go.
Anything else you want to say?
Knock the Guidestones down.
Alright. Is there anything else you would like to say?
I would just like to say if anyone is wavering on this and as a Christian, I think it's probably come down to this, that this is a sacred place for the cultic groups. This is a place that they worship. This is not just a fable or story that someone made up. This is a real thing, and they do go up here and worship. As I said, we've seen it firsthand, and just like to make you aware of that.
We write runes out in the dirt from the Lord of the Rings books, and just to make people think it was witchcraft, because, you know, that's funny to nerds, I guess.
It's just something that Mr. Finley wanted to do, you know, and he just he was a smart man, you know, in the granite business. He was real talented and all.
I don't think that there was a mysterious donor. It's just a few guys got together, pulled off a prank, but it was a good one, you know.
As far as what Elberton Granite Finishing Company did as far as manufacturing it, it was a piece of work. And I give them total credit for that.
A lot of people comment about it, whether it's good or whether it's bad. I got no opinion. If you read it, you got to, you know, form your own opinion.
The Georgia Guidestones is a very interesting subject. Ever since they were erected, it's been 2 different stories. One is it's just fabrication for having tourists come to the area. That's one version. The other version is, and some folks really believe this, and it's very well possible that it is true and authentic.
So the whole RC Christian thing was the real deal?
Could be.
Could be. What do you think?
I'll just leave that one up in the air. Let folks come down here and check it out. And this is actually, the saying that I'm fixing to quote is one that has went from many, many, many years. We're actually in the beautiful red hills of northeast Georgia.